thank you everybody for being here, and thanks for the invitation. Today I was asked to speak specifically about this project. And this was a project that I undertook a little while ago with two terrific colleagues, Dr. Stephen Rinn at the University of Queensland and Dr. Laura Alfrey at Monash. So we're going to go straight to some context for this project. So numerous definitions exist for this thing that is the neoliberal university, but for us the concept of the neoliberal university was really nice shorthand for the idea of a university as a market-driven system which employs corporate modes of governance. And I was telling one of my brothers about what I was doing today, and I was describing this thing. He said, so basically it's running the university like a business. Isn't that a good thing? So in some ways that's a useful definition to work for. It's this idea of running the university like a business. So while we were cautious about drawing straight lines between neoliberal ideologies and any of the trials or all of the trials and tribulations of joys of being an early career academic, we remain committed to that concept for two reasons. Firstly, because we think it captures so well the drivers and the effects of relatively recent and significant transformations in higher education. So the neoliberal university, for example, requires lots of productivity and compressed timelines, entrepreneurism and attracting funding, greater efficiency in dealing with reduced resources and increasing demands that mean academics are becoming subject to and complicit in kind of timelines and accountabilities that are transforming their work, their practices, themselves, their institutions. All of this stuff was happening, and we thought the idea of the neoliberal university captured that. Secondly, we also liked it because it suggested that it wasn't always like this. Things were different previously and might be different again. And that's not to romanticise the past. Kathleen Lynch has a beautiful, it's on YouTube actually, if anybody's interested, she has a really nice presentation on new managerialism, gender care and higher education in Ireland. And she talks about how universities have always been under different kinds of control, be it religious or political, and so we're under a kind of an economic control, or the economic model is dominating now. So she sees parallels between how universities function in the past and now, but still is aware that things have been different, can be different again, and we do need to do a little bit of thinking about how and why we've got to where we are and how we can build ourselves out of it. So that's the second reason we're sticking with the neoliberal university. So as early career academics functioning in and critical of this market-driven system, Stephen, Laura and I decided or started chatting about ways in which we might work to generate and learn from the experiences of our peers in the academy. And I, as it happened, was reading a beautiful little book called Letters to a Young Poet, and it's by Rainer Maria Rilke, and he is an Austro-Hungarian poet, and the letters basically came about because a budding young poet called Franz Kappes, he was trying to choose between a career in the Austro-Hungarian army and pursuing a career as a poet. And so what he did was he took some of his poetry and he said, I'm going to send it to a leader in the field, and he shipped it off to Rilke and said, advise me, give me advice. And so what the little book I was reading were these letters back from Rilke, and they're fascinating and beautiful. So I was reading that, and then ISIP, a conference that many of the people in this room know and participate in, or are fellows in, etc., they were looking for some support around early career mentoring and stuff, so that was happening at the same time. So I was reading this and I was chatting to my colleagues, and then that's basically what informed the design of this research project. So that there was a gap in the literature. There was very little written about early career academics in the field of physical education, sport pedagogy in particular. But the gap in the literature wasn't the only thing that motivated this project. It was like a serendipitous coming together of many things. So just a brief note on methodology, and there's too much writing on that slide, but it's just to give you an overview what happened, or what the design that the project took included. And it was a narrative inquiry. We were interested in the stories of these early career academics, so we were interested in how the the profs constructed their advice, and yeah, the stored experiences of both of these groups of participants. We had incredible success in gathering these narratives, and really quickly. Everybody who was approached, almost everybody, seemed to want to contribute to the project and did it really quickly. So people were keen and eager and willing to talk about their experiences. And basically the ECAs we asked, what are the challenges, the frustrations and the joys of being an ECA? It was really, really broad. And we chose early career academic as opposed to early career researcher because we wanted to reflect a kind of a, the broader remit of many of their roles. So that became more inclusive and also more respectful of the many different kinds of work that they engage in. So basically the early career academics, they wrote narratives. We then did something quite creative in that we constructed 3 composite letters from the narratives. That was tricky, not straightforward. We did a thematic analysis at one point. We did a kind of a more narrative analysis where we were looking at setting and causal relationships, and we played with the data quite a bit because it was always going to be impossible to represent the huge range of experiences in any one letter or 2 or 3, but we wanted to try to do justice to the data. So we played with those letters quite a bit, and we sent them back to the early career academics, and there was an overwhelmingly positive response. Yes, I'm in that letter, and that letter, and that letter. There was two participants who didn't, and one of them, there was actually one because the letters, some of them were direct quotations, and one of the participants, Jason's letter had a whole paragraph from this one individual who wrote back, and he didn't see himself in the letter, but that was because maybe we had because they were composites, the causal relationship might have been different, but that was even interesting. And another participant wrote back, and she said, I see myself there, but I'm horrified. This is a really negative representation of ECAs in the field. They're coming across as far too needy. And so she saw herself in the letters, but she didn't. So there was we had that kind of engagement at multiple points in the process. Then the professors were invited to respond. I think 13 profs were initially invited to respond, and one, and if you knew him you'd appreciate this, and one said, which was very, I think he might have read Letters to a Young Poet. He said, you need to live this thing. I don't have any advice that's going to be useful to you. And so he didn't write the letter. And another didn't make the timeline. So we had a really good response rate from those profs that were invited. And so they responded to the 3 composite letters, also in letter format. And the end of the composites tended to include, again, the exact questions that were being asked by the ECAs. And so the profs wrote their letters. We shared them back with all the participants, because they were the responses to the ECA participants. And then we had a symposium. And this was, if you remember the beginning of the project, it partly came about because I had been asked to facilitate something for ECAs. So this became the something for ECAs that Stephen and Laura and I facilitated. And it was a big, huge room, and Mary was there. There wasn't room to sit. It was packed out the doors. This thing, we had no idea it had captured, a sentiment that was being felt. And neither to the conference organisers, it caused a bit of distress. I was madly nervous when I see the room fill. I thought it was going to be a little, but it obviously, it tapped into something that needs to be discussed. And there were 6 of the professors there and a third of the ECA participants. And they were anonymous. The professors weren't anonymous. They signed away anonymity. And that would have always been hard, but I re-instigated, or I gave them pseudonyms in the paper just to keep the focus on the data. But the ECAs were, they never needed to reveal who they were. That was audio recorded and transcribed, so that's another source of data. And ultimately, we produced a special issue that included some of the papers based on this data and other papers. And I just mention that because the drafts of the papers for the special issue all went back to the profs, although they had a tighter timeline than the early career academics, and the early career academics who participated. We asked for feedback, etc. So it was a really, there was multiple times and opportunities to engage with the data. And that wasn't just, based on kind of research or even solely ethical. There wasn't even solely ethical. It was about creating this space for dialogue. It became part of what the project was, but it was kind of woven into the fabric of the thing, and it seemed to work. Okay. I don't know, well, I'll talk a little bit about the theoretical frame, and then we're going to read some data. We thought we were going to do a narrative analysis, situated within the burgeoning literature on the new liberalisation of the university. And then we saw the data. And the data is replete with the playing the game metaphor. And those who know Bourdieu will know that he's a thing or two to say about playing the game. It was crying out about what's valued in particular fields. The blurring of the boundaries became really a huge issue. A kind of a troubling or a shaking of one's kind of primary habitus, dispositions, values, attitudes. So the data took us to Bourdieu. So we hadn't decided on any grand theory that we were going to use, but the data took us to Bourdieu. And then I read Homo Academicus, which, if you're an academic, you should read. It's almost like a guilty pleasure, because you're reading through it and you're analysing your own school, your own department, your colleagues, those you like, and don't get on so well. You're thinking about reputation. You're thinking about promotion. You're thinking about networks. You're thinking about why professors have got to the place they are, and why some early career academics rise more quickly than others. And anyway, Homo Academicus unlocked or opened up the data for me in new ways. What it allowed us to do was to move beyond the personal stories. So that's really important. What Bourdieu helped the little group of us to do was move beyond the personal stories by linking them to the broader social practices, and the relations and the structures of the various fields in which what the ECAs and the profs are operating or functioning. And as we go on, once we start analysing the data, we're going to have some readings first, but once we start analysing the data, I'll crack open some of those terms for everybody. I just think that might be better when applied. We'll do that applied to the data. So we are going to, I'm going to list some audience participation. There are three fake, some of them are actually really early career academics. But so there are three people in the audience who have three roles. These are excerpts, just excerpts from the composite letters. So they're based on the data from the early career academics. I think Jason is first off.
Dear Professor.
Does it go straight to green?
Yeah.
My name is Molly.
Jason.
Emily,
And I'm 4 years.
1 year.
5 years post-PhD.
How kind of you to agree to receive and respond to this letter, which I should warn before you proceed, is, like me, littered
With insecurities and contradictions.
And brimming with ambition.
Before I turn to some of the challenges associated with my early career academic status and my current job, I want to say something very important. For the most part, I love my scholarly work. I am passionate about teaching and research, and recognize that I am privileged to be paid to think, read, write, talk, and teach about things I am usually interested in. I'm in my element teaching.
I strive to be the best teacher I can be, because I truly believe that through my work with pre-service physical education teachers, I can have a positive impact on physical education in schools.
I have received strong university teaching evaluations and a collection of unsolicited positive feedback from my students, supporting my impressive lecturing and tutoring skills. I'm not worried about my teaching.
Research is a whole different kettle of fish. Firstly, there is little to no expectation by my institution that I do any.
I am ambitious, but my ambitions are modest in comparison to the expectations of my university. My university wants me to be a superstar. I want to do good work that has an impact. The university requires me to do good work that has an impact factor.
Stepping down from a research-intensive, well-respected institution to a regional university that has designs on being research-focused has been an interesting experience for me. I am now the proverbial big fish in a small pond, and there are opportunities that come with status.
While I enjoyed the research dimension of my PhD experience, now research is an aspect of my career that brings me great anxiety. Other than one manuscript for my dissertation, I have not been very productive.
What I know of the field has been hugely influenced by my PhD supervisor. He has, in many ways, constructed the field for me. It is he who has steered me in the direction of particular theorists, methods, networks. It is to him I owe much of my writing style, my keen eye for hyperbole, and my affinity with the word actually. Now, in my first real academic job post-PhD, when the time has truly come for the shadow to be stepped out of, I'm struggling. I miss having a champion of my academic efforts as an in-house supporter of whose loyalty I am sure a research mentor. Sad really, isn't it?
I felt immediately at home in the field. By the time I finished my PhD, I had a couple of publications in high-ranking journals, and a couple in some not-so-good ones, but a publication is a publication, right? And I had won multiple early career researcher awards. My first 5 years post-PhD have been a little less seamless. Now I'm finding the big stuff, the stuff that really counts, has been difficult to progress. I've been told that the next big thing for me is to secure some high-status grants, such as some of the big competitive government schemes. And though I've not got a notable track record for an ECA, it wouldn't be strong enough to enable me to be the lead investigator on most grants. But there is no one else at my institution that fits the bill. My colleagues here are not the high flyers that the funding bodies want to support, nor the types of academic I want to become.
Time, confidence, and in-house mentorship related to research specifically have been lacking, and this has negatively impacted on my research productivity. So I poured myself into teaching and continue to fall behind in my research. It's a negative cycle from which I'm struggling to break free. The reality is that I need to focus on the immediacy of my teaching responsibilities. I can ignore the manuscripts I need to finish, the grants I should be applying for, the collaborative networks I must create, but I cannot ignore the students waiting in class for me. This means that while I am keeping my head above water in my institution, I'm drowning, if not drowned already, in the physical education and sport pedagogy field of inquiry.
There is a cadre of great PESP, physical education and sports pedagogy academics at my current institution, and they are lovely people, but they are busy, so busy. Approaching them on my half-baked ambitions, questions and concerns is not such an easy thing for me to do. I mean, I'm not really at the races yet when it comes to my knowledge of the field. I know only one corner of this room that is PESP, one spot near the window, one narrow strip on which I have walked back and forth in my few short years in academia. I have a way to go and feel under pressure to cover the ground too quickly.
One of the most frustrating things about my job is that it feels like my work is never really done. I don't ever clock out and know that I have finished everything that I need to do. There's always something else to work on. And while my bosses at the university would never check in to make sure I'm doing my 7.25 hours per day, they are equally unlikely to ever tell me to cut back on my teaching, research or service. As I said before, I'm prepared to put in the hard yards now and do all that I can to get ahead, but also know that I can't do that forever, can I? I'll be getting married soon and hopefully children will follow. I couldn't possibly meet my responsibilities as a parent and maintain the workload I currently undertake, but I can't see any lightening of the load in the future.
The bottom line is that if I want to build on my doctoral research, which at least a few people thought was worth publishing, I think I might have to move to another institution. This is not an easy or straightforward decision for me. I have a family, an amazing husband, and 2 beautiful boys who are happy here. Do I seriously consider uprooting my family, who I already spend far too little time with for the sake of my career?
So I am always and simultaneously walking tight ropes between impact and impact factor, teaching and research, work-life balance and ambition, reality and aspiration, success and failure, happy and sad.
So I guess my 2 big questions are, what advice do you have for ECAs with research ambitions who find themselves stuck in teaching-intensive institutions? And how might ECAs initiate and sustain mutually beneficial relationships with mentors who may reside outside their own institutions? Sorry for bombarding you with all this. It's just so much easier to write about this stuff than it is to cold call established scholars. I always feel as if I'm encroaching on their precious time.
What do I want from you? I guess I want to know what you're thinking as you read this letter. What advice do you have on how I might weather all these competing demands on my time and remain true to the kind of engaged scholarship I value, to the kind of PESP futures I imagine? How did you do it? I'm also interested in what you think the most important contributions of ECAs to the field could and should be.
I'm self-aware enough to know that my letter might be read rather cynically, but I think much of what I've voiced here is what many ECAs think but don't want to say. Any advice you can offer would be appreciated. Yours sincerely, Jason.
Molly.
Emily.
Can we say thank you for all of them? You did a lovely job, and I just asked you beforehand. So maybe should we get a little reaction maybe to those letters? What did people think as they were read? Did anything jump out as unusual?
I found them really emotional, I have to admit.
Yeah.
I was sitting there and I'm actually quite emotional listening to them. That's all.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Very powerful.
Very good.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with all the previous speakers. Yeah, it's very powerfully emotional. But I was wondering, motivationally, how did you get people to reveal themselves so openly and
I
honestly?
have no clue, Jim. Like, it was, you know, you're talking about, like, you know, when I go back to the email, like, it was personal for me too, right? You know,
Right.
I was an early career, actually, the definition for early career was within 8 years. That's a UQ generous definition.
Right.
I literally, I think I told them about like, one of the quotes that was read was a direct quotation from Rilke. Some of them went and read the book, you know, when I shared with them the background to the project. So some of them, I don't know if that pushed them to write a little bit more emotionally, but I think partly it was the draw. See, what they wrote was going to be taken seriously. They were going to get answers from the profs to their questions.
Right.
I think the methodology influenced it.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll see, I'll show you, these kind of emotive, troubling, like powerful passages, and it was a little gendered. The female, there was more. The females were more. They were in the male data too, but the females were more likely to use the language of drowning or drowned, or like it was more emotive. Not that the males didn't, but yeah, I think they felt it was anonymous and they were going to get people they respected responded to. Did that influence it?
And even perhaps even a bit therapeutic. You know, this is probably stuff that people are really, really grappling with in terms of the tensions in their work and how they kind of navigate steps forward.
One of the US, a female early careers, she said, "I don't care what happens now. This was good." You know, that was one of her replies to the. You know, when I was getting back to them and I was letting them know, "Oh, this is what we'll do next." She's like, "I don't care if nothing happens with it." Writing that thing was, you know. So some of those exchanges were beautiful too. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just looking, I'm just going to unpack that data a little bit more. And so the three themes, and this is available in the paper, but the three themes that we discussed the data under, because it's where we arrived, were overlapping fields, crises of habitus, and playing the game. So a field is a space in which you inhabit or in which you function. It could be a social setting, it could be an institutional setting. Different people define fields differently. For the purpose of this, we're using Bourdieu's, that's the definition that we're using, and the three dominant, or the three most frequent fields constructed through the data were the university, the family, and PESP. The actual, so PESP is physical education and sport pedagogy. It is the field that it's the discipline in which we operate, and there are different definitions for field and discipline, and we can argue about that, but the boundaries were actually drawn by the participant data in this case. When they talked about the field, they tend to identify it as pest, so that was really easy for us. That was something that was meaningful to them. So the pest field, or community, as some refer to it as, and that's even interesting, that was constructed in really contradictory ways. So there was some consistency in how they constructed, there was more consistency in how they constructed the university. So for some it was a safe haven, really positive, really inclusive, you know, I step out of the field for a while and I come back and I'm welcomed, that kind of thing. So about a third were really happy with PES. 2/3 were not. It was narrow in focus if you didn't do research on motivation or teacher education, or, you know, and these kind of focuses, the foci were identified. Then you were excluded. If you didn't have the in-house champion, if you weren't in with somebody respected in the field, it was exclusive. If you didn't know the right people, there was data from different countries that said jobs were gone. Jobs had been given out before the interview to people in the know. There was more of that data than you would like, so that was troubling data. There was a discussion of a leadership vacuum in the field. So there was a perception that, and some of the data, there was a generosity of spirit, because they were saying, look, we understand why the senior people in the field aren't mentoring, because they're under pressure too. You know, they're involved, they're participating in the same performative regime, and there's really good reasons why. You know, and they took some responsibility. We're not approaching them with their half-baked ambitions or ideas because they're so busy. So there was that happening. But that, the field was constructed in contradictory ways, more data constructing it negatively, which is interesting because if we look at the prof data later on, the professors construct the field of physical education and sport pedagogy quite differently and quite uniformly. In terms of the university, the field which they spoke about most frequently was the university. It's the field that when they were talking about their academic work in particular, it was the university. PES was mentioned less than the university. And so the data basically repeatedly evoked ECA's lived experiences of economic rationalism, of managerialism, competitive performativity, unreasonable accountability, unnecessary bureaucracy, and there was a real, you know, if that data is kind of powerful and emotive, there was almost venom in some of this data. You know, it was powerful, but in a different way. I'm fundamentally troubled by the economic model by which university is run. As pedagogue at heart, I've become increasingly cognizant of and unsettled by the statements and lines of questioning from those higher in the university that foreground economics with little regard for educational value. Lots of this kind of reflection on what they saw as an institution that had stopped, one of the quotes, it stopped being about education, it's all about the money, show me the money. Like that was the kind of vibe that, or the kind of sentiment that was expressed through the data. So while they did, you know, and one of the participants was a mother and she talked about the flexibility being amazing. But at the same time, she was talking about how she, as a woman who was not mobile and willing to travel now, was not eligible to apply for some of the grants that might have allowed her to accelerate her career or move her career in particular directions. So she talked about the flexibility, but on the other hand, she talked about the inequities associated with what was happening. So more data on the university, and you would have to say the dominant narrative about the university was negative. So the third field of interest, we heard some of it in the composite letters, was the family, a significant source of personal tension, and this was the most frequently constructed neglected field. This was the field in which they were actually those, and a small number didn't mention family, I should say, but those who mentioned family had all sorts of guilt around how compromised their time and investment in their family was. And issues to do with this was often associated with the flexibility of academic work, ironically. You know, it's too flexible in some ways because there's no, when do you go to sleep? As well as helping us to understand the boundaries or lack thereof of the fields in which, and that's something also important, you need to analyse these fields relationally. So it was important that we try to understand how these fields were constructed and look at the relationships between these fields to get a better sense of how these participants were functioning in the fields, as well as helping us to understand the boundaries, that kind of family data, together with the data related to teaching, often attested to what Zippin and Brennan, it's a beautiful article, and it's about ethical dispositions in neoliberal university, and they talk about suppression. They talk about crises of habitus. And a crisis of habitus is when we suppress particular values, ethical dispositions we hold dear, in favour of playing the game better, because there's a particular institutional reward or benefit associated with doing things otherwise. So this kind of crisis of habitus, and I should say for those who aren't reading Bourdieu, habitus are dispositions, attitudes, values. Primary habitus are those that we usually develop pretty early on in life. The kind of values that might be instilled in you in the family home, etc. And we also develop secondary habitus as we navigate life and relationships in the world, and we're being challenged and changed in ways that are good and not so good. So a crisis of habitus might be said to occur when ethical dispositions that the individual embodies are suppressed or compromised. So we had no shortage of data that would evidence, and I'm wary, I don't like the word crisis for all sorts of reasons, but we had no shortage of data that made us think that this was a useful way of thinking about it. So we see lots of the effective costs here associated with trying to do it all. Some nights I'm up till 1 or 2 in the morning trying to get something done so that I can move on to new tasks the next day. I feel as if most of this pressure is self-imposed, but I never feel comfortable walking away from my work. I always feel as if I have something else to do, and that if I don't do it right now, it will not get done. My approach to my work has and continues to put a strain on my marriage. My wife is not an academic and doesn't understand the lifestyle. The problem is that I am tired and I am afraid. I'm tired of feeling like no matter how hard I try, it doesn't matter. I'm tired of chasing ISI publications for the sake of fulfilling a bureaucratic notion of what is good enough. I'm tired of everyone looking to me, the junior lecturer, as the one who will volunteer for everything. I'm tired of choosing whether to go for a run or to work on a grant application. And I've included more. I could have included, 25 of these kind of running paragraphs about this. Thus far I've not mentioned research as an aspect of my early career that brings me joy. That is because scholarship is an aspect of my career that brings me great anxiety. Other than one manuscript, my dissertation, I've not been very productive. And we saw some of this in one of the letters actually. This is direct quotation included in the composite letter. The longer I go without being productive, the worse I feel about myself as a scholar. How can I do more than keep my head above water? How can I find the part of me who's capable of handling my professional responsibilities well, so that my work is enjoyable rather than something I want to escape? We'll just do one more of these just to, put the nail in the coffin. I further struggle with the recent trend towards science as impact factor. Much this trend influences what kind of science and how science is practiced. I find this problematic and at times poses a personal conflict that I find difficult to solve. For example, I must publish in particular journals, even though other outlets would be more effective in terms of social impact. I'm aware that following either the science as impact or the science for impact trend, I have to compromise either on my career development or on social impact. So we're seeing these tensions, and again, no shortage of data in relation to our early career academics experiencing this kind of internal conflict as they struggle to make these accommodations that seem to be necessary to their secondary habitus to allow them to play the game well. See how I'm scaffolding Bourdieu throughout this presentation. Stop me and ask questions at any point. So the final, theme constructed from the ECA data was about playing the game, and the early career academics were very aware that some people were more sophisticated at playing the game than others. And there was all, they came up with all sorts of reasons for this, including that idea that if you have a supervisor who cares about you beyond the publication, the completion beyond you as a number, and that's a causal relationship that came up quite often, that can help you actually play the game, that you become versed in, you can verse in the culture of academia, and you develop skills that you might not have otherwise. I'm indebted to my PhD advisor who not only guided me through the research but exposed me to the rules of the game of academia. This involved gaining an understanding of the balance between teaching, research and service. Not only was I given the opportunity to experience each of these areas, but also the more tacit understanding of the politics in gaining and maintaining the balance and dynamics of differences between research-intensive and more teaching-focused institutions. Some sort of grammatical issues in that, we'll leave it off. You get what you say. And in contrast, as a PhD student, the focus was on completing the thesis. I feel my supervisor, consciously or not, held me back from full engagement in the world of academia. So there was about 4 or 5 who talked about their advisors in quite negative terms, and described the relationship as quite functional and not going beyond the requirements. I think one of the direct quotations was something like, "She met me once a month for 1 hour as required by the policy of whatever," it was in that she didn't there was concern that this particular advisor hadn't attended her graduation or hadn't sought to think about her post. It felt like a really transactional relationship. So there was some of that kind of stuff in relation to playing the game. There were a few differences, and this is interesting. Because if you read Homo Academicus, you're expecting to find something else in the data. You're expecting a specificity associated with academic socialization, a specificity associated with what's valued in one field, for example. But what this data seemed to be suggesting was that the field of physical education and sport pedagogy isn't that different to many other fields now, because of the neoliberalisation of the university, because the metricalisation of everything, numbers count, and that's problematic, but also potentially useful if you start to think of early careers in other disciplines as being additional sites of support. Again, the personnel or the people around seem to matter in terms of ticking the boxes, helping you to identify the boxes to be ticked and then ticking the boxes. So key people, advisors, senior people who took an interest in you, this was people heavy. And the early careers were keen to learn the rules of the game, and some of the profs actually took exception with how much that metaphor was used. They didn't like that metaphor at all, but that was the metaphor that was used, so, and that's what we got. This idea, and I mentioned this previously, the male academics, also we talked about the gendered analysis of some of that crisis of habitus data. The male academics were also more likely to speak about ambition, explicitly, promotion, the confidence, a kind of a, I can do this, show me the way. They were more, again, more instrumental and in their questions and what they shared. So do I acknowledge the inevitable? Just focus on collecting the right stamps on my passport, and this I mean CV. There was more of a hurry and an urgency as well in some of the male narratives. And again, it wasn't a huge sample. It's really hard to say anything, but that was definitely a trend. It was easy. When sometimes I'd pick up one of the we'd print them all off and they were highlighted, and we did use in Vivo also, but there was hard copies, and you pick it up and you might have turned over the page, and I kind of have judged which is right or wrong. You get a sense pretty early on, and I should say also these narratives were 2 to 3 pages long. Some 2 of them now were bullet points, but the majority of them were 2 or 3 pages long.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just when you're talking there, did you ever write your own narrative prior to doing the analysis?
Yeah. So the 3 of us wrote our own narratives. Yeah. And we did it to kind of, to test what we were asking. And yeah, I knew that something good was, after we did that, I thought, because we shared each other's with each other. And after that, it became clear that there might be value in the, the crazy method that was influenced by a book that was being read. And, because it was all a bit messy to begin with. And it didn't start as a research project. I think that's really important in some ways. It started as me thinking about how do I facilitate a kind of, a creative but interactive dialogic space for these discussions about mentoring to happen. And then as it proceeded, maybe because I'm more of a neoliberal subject than I like to admit, as it proceeded I was double dipping, and it was this and it was that and it was the kitchen sink. Okay.
So can I ask before you go on?
Yeah.
Playing the game, you chose that as a label to represent data. I'm just thinking, had you chosen another phrase, so playing the game has rightly or wrong has negative connotations.
Yes. Yeah.
So had you titled that academic expectations,
Yeah.
would we be reading and hearing a different narrative?
We might be. That's a really good point. So there was 2 reasons for choosing playing the game, because it's directly referenced 9 times in the 30 narratives. So there's that, and Bourdieu. So Bourdieu, he was like, So Bourdieu, so Bourdieu talks about playing the game and the sophistication, and he talks about the feel for the game and how your habitus is adjusted to. It is easier to succeed if you have a particular feel for the game, and he uses that metaphor. And maybe it was lazy then, is it lazy? But it just all kind of, it came together in those ways. But I absolutely take your point on board. And that became, and I haven't shared that data, and I don't know if we'll get to it, but that became a bone of contention in the symposium. Because one of the academics absolutely rejected the playing the game, one of the profs metaphor. And then the other academic was like, no, but they are playing a game. Like, they are, and they're talking about expectations that are, and so this, like, it kicked off in the symposium over a couple of points of tension. One was this idea that you are your CV, and that became a really lively, animated discussion. And the other one was the kind of interpretation of playing the game as having cynical connotations. Yeah, so had it been called academic expectations, maybe it would have been different, but we're seeing the data, I think, would have taken us there maybe anyway.
Understand.
Yeah. Okay, so that's right. Yeah, I haven't put up, like, mentoring mattered to them. Publication outputs and inputs they know mattered. Speed mattered. These are the kind of things they said mattered in terms of the game, and they were all consistent in that. There was a kind of a shared understanding that the right stamps in the passport are this and this and this, and the right stamps in the passport were, I think, what we would all expect now. Those ISI publications they mentioned, they're talking about spots on editorial boards, and they're early career academics and just out of PhDs. It's this rush to collect these right stamps in the passport. Okay, so the findings illustrated that many ECAs are experiencing these crises of habitus as they work to suppress their ethical dispositions and values and adjust to the rules that the universities are playing by. There were definitely effective costs. We see a lot of effective costs to their sense of self and their family, etc., associated with playing by their rules. They were blaming themselves, so they'd individualise the responsibility for that. In many cases, in some cases they were happy to blame a supervisor. That was the second port of call. But the majority kind of individualised the responsibility and the blame for making things happen. Many of them hadn't kind of discussed or shared these feelings with others, which I found interesting. With others, either as part of a cohort experience, etc. So 2 of them said, this is the first time I've actually named my experience. So that was interesting and a little bit worrying. It suggests that we need to do a better job of helping early career academics to talk about these things. I think for us, we again drawing on Burja, we thought there was a need for greater kind of reflexive vigilance, that we need to continue talking and exposing the power structures, what's harming our sense of selves, what's causing us to compromise our ethics and the values we hold dear, and a need for ongoing dialogue and collective resistance. These are kind of like working conclusions in a way from that. I'm going to pause it here, maybe we'll have a little chat and we'll see how we go, and then we might read some of the prof responses back to the letters after we've had a little chat maybe. So at this point, reflecting on that data, what are your thoughts? Do you think this is reflective of a particular cohort of early career academics?
Yeah.
Expand, expand.
Oh no, it all resonates, right? I mean, it all resonates in different ways.
Do you think it's peculiar to early career academics?
Oh, I can't say. What struck me actually when you're talking about the crisis of habitus is around how quickly within systems like universities and neoliberal operation of neoliberal systems within spaces like be it site-specific fields like PSP, or more broadly how you're quickly kind of conditioned into and very quickly find yourself, unless you're reflexive about it, conforming to and producing materials that are, for outcome or for measurable outputs or whatever. And I'm thinking particularly of myself in a scenario the other day where I had the opportunity to lead on something, and it was, and I had the opportunity to have my own values involved in that in a very strong kind of way. And I found myself doing this really neoliberal exercise type approach. And it was only in reflecting on, I suppose, the kind of usefully other people going, what the hell is that? Conversations to actually think about how in that space I found myself conditioned into these particular mechanisms and metrics. Sorry, that was one thing that struck me just when you were talking about the crisis.
My comment would be how incredibly important it is for us to see this as what I would call, for want of a better term, which would be the part of the curriculum. In other words, the opportunity we talk about particularly we're all in the teaching domain, so we talk about preparing young teachers for careers as lifelong learners. We talk about helping them to make the transition. And the degree to which there would be a number of my colleagues, and I don't mean colleagues in this department, but there would be a number of my colleagues that would see absolutely no space or appropriateness for discussing these kinds of things in the PhD. The PhD is fairly narrowly confined. But I think if somebody is going into academia, it behooves us to think about, helping them to understand that environment. And then for those of us who are in that environment, that in fact we provide space, like this to actually talk about what that means. And the degree to which we can or will or want to resist or not, but at least that we articulate the feelings. The fact that many of these people never talked about this says something to us about how do we come across as a field in helping to socialise our younger colleagues.
Yeah, and I don't think it's, I've got a good friend in medicine and law, and I think many of these things are felt in different fields and disciplines, and they're not specific they're certainly not specific to physical education, sport pedagogy, but I think that it is that neoliberal ideology is all pervasive. It's changing how many institutions function. There are new kinds of accountabilities, and I think when it becomes the air you breathe, you stop you stop saying it and you stop questioning it, and etc. Okay, we're going okay for time. Can I ask you, how do you think professors would have responded? So they're asked, you're all professors now in the room, I've anointed you. No, you don't get anointed. You're anointed. I've appointed you as a professor. Some of you already are on your own merit. How do you think the professors responded to those data?
I probably expect to see some reflection on when they were, kind of looking back,
Yes.
maybe, kind of relating to your own personal experience.
Yeah. And there was some of that. Not but there was some of that.
Well, you've given us a clue already, Eimear, because you told us like that they literally broke out at the symposium when playing the game.
It was just two, and it was two who happened to be quite similar. Well, it was two, not quite similar. They were like both in governance positions in research-intensive universities, and they shared a perspective. And they were active in their governance positions, and there was a critical feminist scholar who, was retiring and was probably a little bit more loosely bound to the institution. And again, there might be very good reasons for why they might invest in a particular position, but I've given you a hint, but I can give you more. Any other ideas about how anything you want to see in the prof responses?
Some sort of surprise, as they indicated, it's self-imposed, really. I know supervisors want you to produce research that's going to get into ISI journals, but after that it is very much so something you put the pressure on yourself, so perhaps the professors aren't as aware of the struggles of the early career researchers.
Yeah, and that was one of the perspectives shared by one or two early careers afterwards. Generosity of spirit about pull up your socks and get on with it. So again, returning to the kind of individualisation of responsibility for what's happening, and a reminder of privilege. Okay, so we're going to read. We have 6 speakers, and they're going to read. These are actual responses from some of the profs' letters, and some of the some of the little sections speak to the previous speaker, speak back to the previous speaker, etc. So you'll see some of that. And we're just thinking about these letters now in the context of some of the data we've just heard. So speaker 1 is Johanna, I think.
Dear Molly, Emily and Jason, firstly I want to thank you for your letters you've sent me and for being so open in addressing your various frustrations, aspirations, joys and challenges as early career academics in the field. Being invited to respond is something I see as a privilege, and I will do my best to add something worthwhile to the important discussions you have initiated.
Your letters were honest, though at times contradictory. There was a greater degree of stress and insecurity in your reflections than I expected. I had hoped to read more of your excitement for your career ahead. Being an academic is a great job with terrific freedoms and privileges.
Well, you are certainly right about one thing. Your composite letters are bursting with familiar themes and concerns. In reading them, I had a strong sense of déjà vu, which was interesting and also somewhat depressing. It reminded me that universities can appear to be schizophrenic institutions. On the one hand, they exist to promote academic freedom and innovation, while on the other hand, they can feel almost wholly constrained and constraining.
I am not certain that I want to return to that time of my professional career. The uncertainty, the insecurities, the steep learning curve. But experience in the job does allow you to gain confidence for your accomplishments and failures around teaching, research, and service to your academic unit, university, and profession. Universities have become more corporate, with accountability for work output more explicit and more public, be it tenure-track career paths and or assessments of research accomplishments. It is a harder place to work.
I'd first like to address the excellent closing question raised in Molly's letter. What do you think the most important contribution of early career academics to the field could and should be? Paraphrased more bluntly, why do universities employ ECAs? Ask yourself, why has the university you're working chosen to appoint you as an ESA rather than a more experienced academic who has an established record? Responses will vary. We wanted someone with recent experience in schools. Budget dictated, we needed a less expensive appointment. The teaching profile was such that we wanted 2 SA greater than 1 more senior appointment. We have a top-heavy profile and are looking and investing in the future. With ECAs, we can induct them into the expectation of our university culture. ECAs are more mobile and therefore more likely to fill our contract position.
Molly asked, what advice do you have on how I might weather all the competing demands on my time and remain true to the kind of engaged scholarship I value? My gut reaction is to say, with difficulty, managing, juggling, coping, and not always too well. Academics at all levels, including myself, can relate all too well to the tensions you have drawn attention to, between desires to pursue issues you are personally passionate about, make the difference you want in the field, and amongst a range of professionals associated with it, maintain quality and credibility in your scholarship, and the parallel institutional and systemic pressures to do particular sorts of research, pursue agendas and questions that have the potential to generate funding dollars, maintain a neat flow of publications in the right journals, and amidst this also deliver on quality teaching expectations and build a profile of service contribution within and beyond your institution.
I can let you in on a secret. Many of us further up the career ladder, at least myself and many colleagues I know, feel much of what you voice. I often feel insufficient and hope that I will not be found out, revealed to be inadequate and not good enough. I wonder, why do we feel the need to apologise for not being perfect in all areas of life? Why do I, for example, feel the need to apologise for not writing and speaking perfect English?
When I read the letters, I was a little sad at first, that in one sense that academia is a place where these things occurred. Then my surprise was that so much of what was shared was quite instrumental. I mean, it looks not always, sometimes it looked like it was about doing good work. It was about doing good CVs.
So what advice do I offer to you ECAs? Look after your CV because it is your passport to your future career. That sounds obvious, so let me explain. Application forms for academic posts usually offer space to write all sorts of explanatory detail about why you want a post and what you can offer. The truth is, however, that CVs are unforgiving documents and they are very easy to read. They offer a clear picture of the applicant, and senior academics are adept at reading them, at seeing the history and judging future potential.
Doing good work is about passion. With this I mean good, interesting, and rewarding work, whether it's research or teaching, comes best when guided by passion. Passion for the questions, for the answers, for the process, for the people, for the data, for the writing, for the collaborations, for the impact, and not for the impact factor, Molly. For making a difference, and for the joy of seeing other people grow. From passion also comes curiosity and a will to learn and grow. And here you, as early career academics, have a lot to teach us and to help us who have been in the field for a while.
You should consider if the research questions you would like to address are robust and relevant to the aspiration of your university. It may be that as an ECA, you may need to reshape your interests to align more closely with your institutional colleagues, thereby opening up opportunities for working in grants, joint publications, and conference presentations, and the like.
While I had sympathy for much of what you wrote, my first feeling was that the letter seemed to me to be based on a totally unrealistic view of what a university actually is. I thought you had a slightly romantic view of what a university could or should be, or you wished it was. But I thought it was slightly unrealistic, because I don't think universities are those places, and probably haven't been for some time. I do think if you want to change things, improve the lives of research participants, then if that's the case, the university, The system can help you to do that, to do more than impress your friends, the 10 people you know in your little community, the people who agree with you, can go out there and actually make a much bigger impact. Now, if you want to do all of that, then actually the university structures, that's what they want you to do. That's what they want you to do too.
I actually think in a way you're referring to the last speaker, romanticising the university. I think one of the things that I see in the letters is that they're receiving information about expectations that are pretty narrow. But they're probably from senior people, even presentations at the university that are saying, if you're going to be a worthwhile person, these are the sorts of things that you count.
The other thing I did say was that I'd sit with the people who come into my office and they want a promotion and they have not read the promotion criteria. This is madness because the first thing you need to do as an ECA is take a look at those. They tell you what the university wants you to do. The university is your employer. Your salary comes from teaching and research. That's really fundamentally where it comes from, mostly the institution. They tell you what they want. Now you can balk against that if you like, but then don't expect to get promoted if that's what you want. Get those out, look at them, and if you're overachieving in one bit of it, you need to really moderate that. Temper some of the things you like doing if you need to achieve in other areas. It's just the way it is.
Without high quality research outputs in the form of papers, books and chapters, you will eventually reach a ceiling on where your career can go. In writing this, I am aware that some people will see this claim as elitist. I don't. Peer-reviewed publication is the very stuff of academic culture, and you have to be good at doing both the research and writing it up. It's a non-negotiable, essential, core competence for an academic.
So my advice is, ensure you are developing a career independent of your PhD supervisor. Identify a clear and precise research agenda. Make sure your research area is of interest to others beyond yourself and your immediate colleagues or collaborators. Yes, go for the grants, get your ideas funded. Be very ambitious and think bigger, and think much bigger. Read your university's promotion criteria, really read them. Take some control. Take important career decisions now. Make important career decisions now while there is still time.
Therefore, my advice is, be patient. Always do what you are more passionate about. Always value quality over quantity. Get to know your workplace. Create your own work conditions. Find a mentor and ask good research questions.
But the abiding question is, how much is enough? Of course, this is like the length of a piece of string question. It all depends. Some of the variables that come to play in this regard include how fast you wish to advance as a result of your achievements, how efficient you are in your work. For example, some of us take longer to complete a manuscript than others, your notion of an appropriate work-life balance, and so on. It is worth saying in regard to work-life balance that for some academics, this is not a binary issue. For some, their research is their life. However, the tales of the greatest scientists, artists and writers is a litany of broken relationships, ignored children, and other issues that might be the wake of an obsession on one thing. Maybe it's worth considering the total life narrative of the academics you admire when you decide on whether or not you want to be like them.
In conclusion, I think it can be tempting to view universities as kindly institutions that will sit behind you, helping you to achieve your goals. I have never found them to be so. Instead, they are places that have lots of opportunities available, but you have to be tenacious, determined and single-minded to get the best from them.
Regards, the professoriate.
Can we thank the participants again? Thank you very much for reading them. And again, initial reactions to those excerpts, they're contradictory, but anything strike you as disappointing, annoying, anything you're glad was there, those kind of responses?
I think they're a bit frightening.
Expand, go.
Every single one of those professors was an early career academic. You know, had they memory, you know, kind of muscle memory loss? To use that PE terminology, you know, just as done to it. The contradictions I can expect, because depending on the types of institutions and the drive and the value set, I can expect that. I even find it funny the way they kind of respond to each other in some regards, kind of pulling each other up. I think that's really funny, you know. One of them kind of pulled the other one up and said, you know, like, if one asked the other. Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody share Joanne's sentiment?
I thought some of those responses were terribly robotic altogether. It was like I was hearing somebody read back section 5 from Ulrich to me. There definitely was somewhere along the line. There was no great sense of them belonging themselves to a community of practice. It was very much they had become, what do you call it, totally taken over by the individualistic nature of the university.
Absolutely. And they were relatively homogeneous, you know, they're profs in the university, they're an individual who has navigated and been rewarded by the conditions that currently exist. And yeah, in many cases, the advice might be interpreted as targeted towards the development of more perfect neoliberal subjects. You know, that was the tenor. There were outliers, I should say. And that's really important. There was outliers, and in any data set, those outliers matter hugely because they allow you to bring the data into dialogue. But I will say the kind of the perception shared was also shared by some of the ECAs, because obviously they were returned to them. And so one email I got from an ECA was, and I didn't do this because our data was limited in a way, and it was constrained by the format and etc. But one of the emails I got was, you will have no trouble sticking it to them in the discussion. That was, you know, it was facetious, and it wasn't whatever. But that was the kind of, and that came from a place that was facetious, but it came from a place of disappointment. You know, I think you can respect that emotion in that case.
Can I just make a comment? As somebody who sat in on that symposium,
yes.
I remember after the symposium and people walking out into the corridors, and I'm particularly talking about senior academics.
Yes.
There was quite a degree of animation. And there were some points of view that were expressed in that symposium that were really responded to and perceived to be quite depressing by others. So I think it is important to sort of present the outliers, that there were people who, in terms of some of the things that were actually articulated in that symposium, were quite frightening to others.
Absolutely, and there were outliers amongst the letters. You know, so that's what I was referring to, that really matters. There was one incident, and actually the ECA involved in the incident has gone on to write her own letter. There was another incident in the symposium where incredibly bright early career academic talked about her struggles. So she's trying to answer big philosophical questions in the field, and she was saying how difficult it is to do this kind of scholarship. You know, because it's longitudinal, it's not easily fundable. She's playing with big ideas, and one of the academics, one of the profs present, this was another sticking point of the symposium, suggested that perhaps that was the kind of research question that was better pursued from outside the university. And so there was multiple correspondence that I was involved in afterwards that, it was live, it was emotive, it was troubling, it was powerful, it was a mess post this session.
Just something that struck me in the responses was a lack of emotion or personality, and I would have, you know, coming from a very emotional and personal letters from the ECAs,
Yes.
you know, you didn't hear, there was no story, I had no narratives in there, they were very responsive.
No, but in defence of the professoriate, they were not anonymous. Now, I did anonymise them in the letters, but also many of them held positions of, they had the academic capital or power associated with the positions of governance they held in their university. So they weren't as safe to speak. So I think that needs to be factored in too. And their words were read and analysed and reread. In that context, there was a protection of self. So I get that to some extent, but that maybe, and for some, it didn't excuse that the majority of the advice seemed to be focused on and individualising the responsibility for aligning yourself with institutional priorities rather than challenging or changing the status quo. So that was interesting.
Does that kind of skew it then a little bit though, Eimear, that the professoriate, because they weren't anonymised, like, isn't there a huge kind of,
Yes.
and excuse my language here now, but isn't there a huge kind of dependence there that they toe the party line?
Yes. So it was different. It was a different context. The rules for engagement were different from the professoriate. One of the ECAs said that you would think that at that point there would be more. They've made it.
That they're safe nearly.
And that there might be a civic responsibility or a civic duty to actually care less about themselves at this point. Are you still? I can say this without repeating. I think those profs. So a prof not in the data set. I'll help this out. I was speaking to him once, and he'd been head of department for. I was speaking to him about careers. He'd been head of department for 10 years, and they couldn't find a new head of department. And so he was asked to stay an extra 6 months. He's a prof, leader in the field, amazing scholar, and he was asked to stay an additional 6 months. And he said, and I said, what are you thinking? And he said, well, what I'm thinking is, I've been the head of department for 10 years. 10 years and 6 months isn't going to add anything to my CV, is it? And this was this was a shocking. This was worrying for me, because you have this kind of, I've got this kind of chronological narrative, and people sort their shit out over time, that they become less selfish and they become more civic, and they, once they find solid ground to stand on, and that's not true. It's taken me a long time to figure that out, but people don't necessarily,
Yeah, it's my experience with some senior academics that it goes beyond just not caring about saying something to just not caring.
An apathy.
An apathy
Yes.
that sets in. In other words, I'll leave that to somebody else to carry the crusade, if you like.
Yeah.
And that was going to be my question as well, that when we say the professoriate here, we're obviously talking about people along a long trajectory developmentally. There's probably people there over a 25, 30 year span.
Well, yes, there are, and that was, so their how new they were to be professors mattered. So
Yeah.
the two real outliers, in the sense that, for example, they were telling people to pursue their passions rather than align with institutional priorities. They were saying that slow down, be patient. To develop your scholarship, you need to read more. They weren't talking about peer-reviewed publications being the very stuff of academic culture. And those two, a male and a female, were also the most newly minted professors. So they weren't as strongly aligned with the governance structures or institutional priorities yet. Now, one of the questions, another early career, and we've had so much conversations about these letters, was chicken and egg. Like, is it those kind of people who become profs? And if so, I don't want it, and I'm never going to get there because I'm not one of them. Or does it make you that kind of person when you're in that role for that long? And again, there were outliers, and there was some passages in some of the prof letters that really, really resonated. We had letters from early career academics who had identified a letter that spoke to them, and it was hanging over their computer now. So there was a mixed and complex reaction in response to those letters.
Sorry, Marie, just to the point, are these full profs? The way you have like...
They're all full profs.
Yeah, because you've got,
Yeah.
Swedish, UK, Irish, so like in terms of
They're all
categorisation,
full profs
full profs.
everywhere. The reason, in response to your other question, the reason they could never really have been anonymous, you know, in the sense that it's a smallish field, and I didn't actually mention, but the profs were from 6 different countries. So we tried to get a gender and a geographical kind of spread, so they never could have been. I'm not going to go through. We've got about 15 minutes left. You've been incredibly good, so I don't know how much to push, but maybe I'll comment briefly on some of these things. The analysis of the prof letters allowed us to say some things, but not others. We didn't get, unlike the ECA data, didn't get a lot of data on habitus. You know, the values, the dispositions. We got a lot of advice. It was kind of instructional, kind of policy. There was some. But what the data did allow us to access was, were the professors' constructions of the university, of the field, and constructions of self in relation to the ECAs, what kind of academics they needed to become. There was some solace for the ECAs maybe in the fact that the majority said universities are a more difficult place to work. You know, I wouldn't want to do it again. You know, it's more difficult now, and so I think that was a bit encouraging. You know, we're not just being mum bags for the sake of it. That things have changed, and some things have changed for the worse, and so that was present. This is the letters being. This is the dialogue that we read out in those letters there. But this idea, this conflict over whether the ECAs were romanticising the university, and that was some of the saddest data for me, because they're the profs. You know, some of these early career academics are, and they should be. You know, the early career, they should be idealistic. They should have great and beautiful ideas about the university as a democratic institution, about deepening and expanding knowledge, and etc. But it's a little bit like they're being slapped in the face. You know, that was the old idea of the university, a la Newman, or you know, this is the new university you're working in. So there's some of that, and the kind of advice for, you know, get to know your university. All universities have pros and cons. Get to know it. Get to know the acronyms. This stuff is really useful advice. Like, you need to. It's sometimes the motives for sharing some of this, but this is really useful advice. You need to understand the field to play the game. You know, even if you're not happy with the playing the game metaphor, I think all early career academics need to spend some time getting to know the university. So there was some really practical advice in the letters. The constructions of PESP, unlike the ECAs, I'm just going to go through this quickly. The professors were all really happy with physical education and sport pedagogy, which is fascinating, because there's a growing literature now on how the field is struggling for status. There's the closure of doctoral programs, but again, maybe it's the context for the project. You know, these professors are being asked by early career academics for advice. Presumably they want to enthuse, and you know, but there was no sense in the professorial letters that there were struggles in the field. They took the early and quick investment of 30 early career academics as a hugely positive feature, lots to be happy about, the field is growing, etc. But there was no sense that the field might be in any danger, which is interesting. And then the data on the construction of self, we've read it, it's targeted towards that neoliberal subject. There was some dissonance, again, in the data, really important to point out the conflicts. We've read those in the letters. Forget about balance, which again, may be problematic. You know, the boundaries are blurry, just embrace the balance. And again, that, in a way that can shut down maybe productive conversations. So this idea, Diana from Australia, balance is something implicit and explicit in your letters as an issue to be addressed. People who know me would say I'm not the person to ask about how to achieve balance. I'm actually not sure it's too helpful a notion. So it's not too helpful a notion because it's difficult to solve, etc. But maybe again not the most useful advice in terms of about shutting down conversations about balance. One of the few, and there were a couple of strategies of resistance. One of the few was, you know, use digital platforms, social media to kind of connect you have opportunities now that others didn't. Reach out to each other. So that they strongly supported a kind of, which is terrific, a horizontal mentorship, so working with other ECAs, and that's kind of what the project produced and was about and was great, but at the same time, not many of them, there wasn't a move towards a community of resistance. You know, ECAs find solace in each other, talk about these things together, band together, but we're out, you know, so that was another troubling reflection in the data, and again, this patience, there was some patience in terms of, advocated in terms of reading by the minority reading and pursuing grants, that was patience. But career decisions, it was like, make them now, be mobile, make important career decisions now before it's too late. So that kind of speed in terms of playing the game and constructing yourself as a particular kind of academic. Okay, so conclusions from, and there are papers so you can read them, but this won't do justice, but basically the majority of the advice was targeted or could be constructed as being targeted towards the development of more accomplished neoliberal subject who's better at playing the neoliberal university game rather than challenging it. A lot of advice which talked about bringing ECAs and helped ECAs align with institutional priorities. But all the time we're thinking, well, fields aren't fixed and they can change. And we know that, and it's difficult, but that wasn't there. You know, there wasn't the sense that we could band together. And again, the Kathleen Lynch talk I listened to yesterday, she was talking about the strength of the teacher unions versus the weakness of the university higher education union. And you know, there's opportunities to speak back and to fight collectively, early, mid, professors working together to kind of change and challenge the direction in which the universities are going that we're not happy with. We didn't see that. And I think for us, what we began thinking about was what would communities of resistance look like in our field, how would that be supported, and how and if we could continue the dialogue that's been began in the letters in a way that's productive. We didn't want to blame the professors, like the same theories that we're using to help us understand why the early career academics are struggling as they are useful in helping us to understand some of the utterances or some of the inputs of the professoriate. So some of it I think is subconscious, they're not thinking about it. They were asked by the early career academics to make their lives easier, you know, and resistance isn't usually easy. So actually this kind of advice might be, because they're responding directly to some of the questions from the early career academics, help me to make my life easier in this institution as it currently is. And in that context, we would have far less issues with the advice. So that makes sense, you know. They're talking to early career academics who they don't know to advocate resistance. You know, maybe part of what's happening here is a protection of the early career academics, and so that's possible. Also, you know, a more cynical reading would be that, like one of the sections of the letters talked about paying your dues, you know, cite me. And another reason would be that they're invested in their own accrual of symbolic capital, etc., and that they give particular kinds of advice that might help them play the game better. They're sophisticated at reading it. You know, there's no reason we wouldn't think the kind of advice that they're given isn't self-interested, etc. Okay, that's what my voice is going. But I think that's about it in terms of the data I'm sharing today, etc. But is there any additional questions now from the floor? We've got about 5 minutes. I think that's okay because we broke for a chat. Yeah.
Comment more. So I think it's really interesting that you say about how this is set up, almost conditions the professors into giving particular kinds of advice. You know, it's set up as, we want you to help us, we will help you, this is how you do it. You know, so we all become embroiled in this, you know, becoming great neoliberal subjects. And my second comment is that I think it's really methodologically interesting, both with how you did the two lots of, you know, to put voices alongside one another like that actually contradict each other. And then also, you know, that layer of, you were saying, someone looking back and seeing their response, and in not recognising the response, you know. So there's a kind of a sense there of subjectivity over time as being quite fragmented, and it also reminds me of the Denzin play that was in Mary I a good few years ago, but how voices...
The elephant in the room.
Yeah, and it's the elephant in the room, and how voices kind of put together in that kind of a fragmented way points to how we're not these linear, simple subjects across time, you know, and had the professors been in a different space and time and in a different kind of context, might have talked more like some of them did. And similarly, other people, and I maybe include myself in this in a different kind of way, would have been a bit more reflexive about how we're quite happy to be neoliberal subjects in being successful and ambitious and, you know.
Yes.
So I think that, for me, that really, the methodological aspect of it really captures that.
Yeah, and I think in a way this wouldn't have happened if we had too much time to think about the methodology. Like this is one of those kind of serendipitous, you know, it all kind of happened quite quickly, and we were making, I think we were really justifiable decisions, but yeah, I think some things we might have done differently, but I still think the output has, and the process has allowed for kinds of engagement that might have been stunted had we had more time to think about the research design of that. Yes, does that make sense, Deborah?
Yes, I'm sorry I wasn't here for the
Okay,
for the whole presentation, Eimear. It was very interesting. I actually am responding to Aoife just then, because I would be very interested to know, to be able to ask the professors why they responded the way they did. In other words, Aoife said when you put the PhD, the new scholars' responses next to the professors' responses, they were contradictory. Well, were they contradictory if the professors thought they were being asked to give advice on how to survive? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And
No.
so I
think
very curious to me.
yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think that does. Yeah, that's the generosity of spirit that's necessary to engage with the professorial letters in the context in which they were written. I think because we expect more from leaders in the field, and also I think they were written as letters. I think we shouldn't forget that. Like the genre, the form really matters too, and I think that might predispose something. But because we've had so much time to think about those letters that might have been constructed really quickly in response to, or they might have interpreted really simply and linearly and not thought about where these were going to go or what they might turn into. Yeah, they wrote in particular ways. But I still think we're justified in being a little disappointed with the dominant narrative across the letters. You can disagree with me on that. Yeah.
How would you advise? This is a loaded question now, Eimear, like so, like
anything less.
It's not loaded that it'll come, you know, but it's probably a desperate question to ask, like at 5:55 in the evening. But I'm left thinking, you know, after hearing, and like, oh my God, I thoroughly enjoyed that input. I found it a bit emotional and distressing at times, I have to admit, not in a good sense.
In a good sense.
But I was kind of left thinking, you know, in the University of Limerick we have a mentoring programme, and you know, all academics are encouraged to engage with said programme. And I'm kind of thinking, you know, if you were to give advice to the University of Limerick in terms of their mentoring programme, like what have you learned from engaging in this piece of research, but also this project nearly of self-awareness for yourself as a researcher? You know, is there any kind of thing that you would say if they were designing a mentorship program for this university, like?
Sounds like an interview
I think
question.
I'm so sorry, but that's kind of what I'm left
thinking.
thinking.
You
And
know?
what I wouldn't say in the interview is
yes, that's the bit I'm interested in. That's the bit I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think if you institutionalise it, you kill it. So I think my experience of formal mentoring programs has not been good. My experience of mentoring, which is, you know, which is about relationship, trust over time, actually coming to know the person where they're at, and that, like, I'm really tough on institutions at the moment, But I do think if it becomes linked to KPIs, if it becomes something that you should do at this point and whatever, it kills it. Because it makes it instrumental. And I think what we're working on is far more complex and important than that. I think it's that civic sensibility. It's a reminder, like, let's return to thinking about what the idea of the university was and how in the name of God did it get hijacked in the way that it has been. So I think it's messier, broader, and again, wouldn't say this in the interview, but this is a long-term project that starts with all of us examining our own values, thinking about the choices we make and don't make, trying to, have those moments where we are choosing the ethical path instead of towing the line, resisting in small pockets, reaching out, helping each other. Not easy, not messy. It's a messy answer, but not to institutionalise it.
Thank you.
Could I join hands in thanking
Thank you.
Eimear's been here long enough that she probably still remembers, and we still have the tradition. And for those who are new to this, anybody who presents, this is when we had money, anybody who presents a Pepays lecture is given our Pepays folder, and actually it's become quite a prized event, quite a prized item. So it is with great honour and privilege that we give you this.
Thank you very much.